Committee members, if you would take your seats, I will call the meeting to order. The clerk has advised we do have a quorum. The witnesses that are appearing virtually have been sound tested and are fine, but one witness is still having an issue with connecting. IT is working on that, so we may have to suspend a moment when they're able to connect that. But with this, I want to call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 126 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, meaning witnesses are appearing virtually and in the room with us. A couple of points I'd like to review before we introduce the witnesses is you have the option to participate in today's meeting in the official language of your choice. In the room, translation is available by selecting the channel you wish to participate in from the microphone in front of you. Those appearing virtually, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your surface. Choose the official language of your choice. If there is a breakdown in translation services, please get my attention by raising your hand, and I will recognize you. We'll suspend while it is being cleared. Again, I want to remind those members who are using the older microphones today, but to make sure you're on the channel that gives you the language of your choice. Also, those in the room, please, if you have all your devices, please make sure they're on mute, including any alarms that may go off. As well as please refrain from tapping the microphone boom to avoid issues with the translators for today's meeting. So today's witnesses we have in the first hour, we have Mr. David Leposki, a chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, appearing in person. From Confédération des Organismes des Personnes Handicapées du Québec, we have Paul Lupin, chair by video conference. Dominique Salgado, chair of the Employee Committee. Appearing from Disability Without Poverty is Michelle Hewitt, and she is still connecting. And we have Mr. Kevin Mills, Goodwill Ambassador for Peddling Possibilities. Before I ask you, we'll begin with Mr. Mills, but before we do, for the benefit, if you're addressing questions to Mr. Leposki, please identify him. So he'll know that you are directing. And themselves as well. Oh, please, and yes, and identify yourself, which MP you are. So we'll begin with Mr. Mills. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Mills.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank MP Tony Van Bryen for inviting me and the HUMA committee for allowing me to speak about an issue that is really personal and important to me, accessibility. I'm sure that everyone here has a loved one, whether a relative, friend, or child, who has been affected by accessibility barriers. Thank you for your efforts to help improve and hopefully fix these obstacles that affect Canadians on a daily basis. I recently had the opportunity to hand cycle across Canada with my able-bodied friend, Nikki Davenport. In May of 2023, we started our journey in Cape Spear, Newfoundland, and after over 4 months of effort, we completed our 8,400-kilometer trip in Victoria, BC. I became the first quadriplegic to hand cycle across Canada in my wheelchair. I would like to start off by saying how beautiful and amazing Canada is. We are lucky to live here. The thing that struck me the most was the people. Everyone was so kind and supportive. Met wonderful people in every province who wanted to help and were enthusiastic about what we were doing. We had people online who are following our trip, donating, spreading our message, cars honking in support, people on the side of the road cheering us on, and handing us food and drinks. And the media coverage was phenomenal. We even had one woman come to our campsite to take our laundry home and wash it for us. When we initially started planning this journey, we just wanted to do it. We quickly realized that what we were doing had the potential to help people and increase accessibility by starting a discussion and encourage Canadians, especially those with disabilities, to get outside and get active. We wanted to show that it was possible. So we created the not-for-profit Pedaling Possibilities Across Canada. One of the best parts about this trip was having people with wheelchairs and hand cycles come in and join us for a leg. I've traveled extensively, and when considering accessibility across our nation, Canada is doing well compared to many other countries. But there is still a lot to be done. I think the most important part of my message is that in terms of ability, in the community of people with disabilities, there are vastly different levels of function. I have paraplegic friends who can pop up a regular curve without difficulty, but for me, a 3 centimeter lip might as well be 10 flights of stairs. At the same time, I have friends with more severe injuries who encounter obstacles I would never have thought of. To continue to improve accessibility in Canada, you need to talk to and involve people with disabilities in the solution, which is what you are doing now. I'm sure the committee is well versed on the challenges that Canadians with disabilities face in terms of travel, including flights, hotels, and accessible showers. At one point in my journey, after not showering for 9 days, the girl said I would not be allowed in the RV until I showered. So, in the campsite, they tossed me in a lawn chair and hosed me off. That mountain water was cold. My main focus today is about an accessible bike route across Canada. Many people bike across Canada every year. What I did was not unique, but my perspective is. A lane which is wide enough for a bike is often too narrow for a wheelchair. Rumble strips set off my spasms, which could send me into traffic. Gate, switch aid, and animal migration are not possible for me to open. Creating and making a truly accessible bike route across Canada would take time and resources. It is worth it. I have often heard the argument that not many people with disabilities would use this. Well, not many people will bike the entire route. Many people will do sections. I would also argue that it will not be used until it is established. We need to build it first. We have a great opportunity to invest in international tourism for people with disabilities. Let us make it happen. My wife and I run a not-for-profit neurological recovery center called Walk It Off. Walk It Off has been helping people with disabilities for over 14 years. We are currently expanding to a larger facility so that we can help more people. While looking for our new facility, it struck me that so many places were inaccessible, even in terms of basic things like automatic door openers. We eventually signed a lease to move into a building, but had to negotiate to get automatic doors installed to enter the main building, which goes into a common lobby. Our not-for-profit is paying half. We are responsible for the doors entering our unit. This is crazy for 2024. If we are going to make Canada truly accessible by 2040, we need to act now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. We'll now go to Mr. Leposki. Mr. Leposki, welcome back to HUMA.
It's great to be here.
You have 5 minutes or so. You have the floor, Mr. Leposki.
The federal government is to be heartily congratulated for deciding that Canada needs accessibility legislation to make this a barrier-free country for over 6 million people with disabilities. The federal government's also to be heartily congratulated for agreeing that we need new legislation to lift hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities out of poverty, which they do not deserve to suffer from. However, the Accessible Canada Act, like the Canada Disability Benefit Act, have both proven themselves to be strong on good intentions, but extremely poor in implementation and impact. I invite you, as part of this review, to ask key questions. Since the Accessible Canada Act was passed in 2019, have we made 25% of the progress we need to make towards the goal the Act sets, a barrier-free Canada by 2040, since we've now used up 25% of the time? What disability barriers has this Act caused to be removed? What steps need to be taken to get us to that goal, since this Act is not working to achieve its goal with the force and effect that is needed? What are the problems? The Act does not, at present, require any disability barrier to ever be removed or prevented in any organization that the federal government can regulate. Not one single accessibility standard that is enforceable in law has been enacted in the 5 years since this law was passed. As a result, progress towards accessibility has been glacial and agonizingly slow. I was invited to speak at a conference in Montreal last spring called Accessible Canada, Accessible World, with leaders on accessibility from across the country, obligated organizations, and the minister responsible. I don't recall anyone in their many speeches ever identifying a single barrier that has been removed in the past 5 years because it was required to be removed by this Act. Now, there may be some out there somewhere, but we should have an impressive list after 5 years, not be struggling to maybe scurry and find a few. Now, I'm not saying nobody's doing anything either to implement the Act or to address accessibility barriers. I am saying that the Accessible Canada Act is itself, as a matter of legal force, not significantly contributing towards its own goal. Its implementation and enforcement is labyrinthian because the law is outrageously complicated to read and even understand. I got 2 law degrees. I practiced law for over 3 decades. I now teach law part-time, and I think I got a specialty in this area. I can't figure out what the damn thing says. And if I can't, I bet you can't either. And if you can't, I bet your obligated organizations are having a tough time. And if they're having a tough time, I bet people with disabilities are having at least that tough time. People with disabilities deserve better. Our brief offers you 10 amendments we need. We recommended all of these 5 years ago when this bill was before Parliament. Sadly, they were all turned down. Had they been accepted, we'd be in a better place. I'm going to mention a couple now. I invite your questions, if I get more time, to explain more. Number 1, we need to impose a deadline on the government to pass at least one accessible standard that is enforceable by law, not a voluntary guideline or standard that Accessible Standards Canada produces. That's thin rule. Nobody has to comply with it. One that's enforceable within 1 year and 4 more within 2 years. We ought to be able to do that at this point. Number 2, this law's implementation and enforcement is splintered incoherently across 3 different organizations: the Accessibility Commissioner, the CRTC, the CTA, those agencies are in a race to see who can go slowest. People with disabilities deserve better. Can we just have one-stop shopping agency that will do it all? That will implement it all, that will enforce it all, that will bring the regs to cabinet to do it all. We have Accessible Standards Canada, but they can only give advice. It's a good start, but we got to do way better. Get rid of this splintered, incoherent, unnavigable mess. It's good the Act requires obligated organizations to make accessibility plans and report on their progress. It doesn't require them to be any good. It doesn't require them to actually implement them. And we can't bring complaints, and those agencies can't enforce if the plans aren't any good or if the plans aren't enforced. Final point, for this short part of our list, not $1 of federal money should ever be used again to create new disability barriers. The Act doesn't require that. Its implementation doesn't require that. And as a result, the government is free to give out money to provinces and hospitals and others for infrastructure projects that can include disability barriers, and nothing is required in this Act to stop it. People with disabilities deserve better. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lepofsky. We will now go to Mr. Lupien for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I am president of the Quebec Confederation of Organizations of People with Disabilities. I'm a member of the board of directors, and I'm accompanied by Mr. Galbado, who is the secretary of our board and as well as the head of our employment committee. Our organization was incorporated in 1985, and its purpose is to make Quebec inclusive by ensuring full social participation for people with functional limitations and their families.
We're not.
My translation is not working.
Nor is mine. Yes.
I don't want to interrupt the speaker, but if somebody can assist me, then I'll...
Yes.
But I'd let the speaker continue, please.
Mr. Chairman, I would also like to have Mr. Salgado included.
Monsieur.
Just one moment, please.
Okay. Is this being translated to French?
This is the English channel. Can you hear the English channel? Very good. So please go ahead again, Mr. Lupien. If we could just have a little bit of extra time, I would like Mr. Galbado to have part of the time, please. Salgado. So I want to introduce myself. I am the head of the board of directors of my organization, our COFAN. I'm accompanied by Mr. Salgado, who is the secretary of our board and is in charge of our employment committee. The Quebec Confederation of Organizations of People with Disabilities was incorporated in 1985, and its purpose is to make Quebec inclusive to ensure full social participation by people with functional limitations and their families. The organization includes nearly 40 organizations that are either Quebec-wide or regional, and we deal with all types of functional limitations and all types of disabilities. We represent more than 1.4 million people with disabilities in Quebec. We are active across Canada and internationally in all areas, including living conditions, transportation, to help people with disabilities and their families. My colleague represents the Institute for Equity, Equality, and Inclusion. We are the only confederation or umbrella group for people with disabilities in Quebec. Our principles are full inclusion, the rule of law, the right to equality, universal accessibility, accommodation, and compensation for additional costs caused by functional limitations. We are calling for a Canada that is barrier-free. In 2019, the House of Commons adopted the Accessible Canada Act, whose aim is to make Canada barrier-free by 2040 and to eliminate barriers in various sectors like employment, buildings, transportation, and so on. The government committed to consulting with people with disabilities to deal with problems, and the idea was to take steps to guarantee full inclusion of people with disabilities in Canadian society by 2040. Organizations like Accessibility Canada are working to help implement the legislation, and consultations with different groups and people with disabilities are underway. Clearly, people with disabilities must be heard, but, Mr. Chairman, I would remind you that the legislation does not require provinces to meet these standards. There is nothing in the Act that will actually deal with anything but Canada-wide organizations, and unfortunately for provincial organizations, there's nothing in this legislation that applies. I have a disability like others do. And as the previous speaker said, it doesn't take much to create a barrier. Something that is 2 or 3 centimeters high can mean that a person is unable to access the service or building. So the government needs to be aware that there has to be teeth in the Act. It has to be enforced. And I will now give the floor to my colleague. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You could address that in questioning, in questions that may come to you, but I do have to move to Ms. Hewitt. Ms. Hewitt, you have not been tested, but begin, and translation will tell me if it's okay. So if you could begin with your opening 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today on the progress that Canada is making towards being barrier-free. So I am Michelle Hewitt, and I'm the chair of the board of Disability Without Poverty. I'm a disabled woman, a full-time wheelchair user, and I live in Kelowna with my husband, who is also a full-time wheelchair user. Talking about accessibility to any level of government is always complicated because responsibility is siloed. However, our lives as disabled people do not work in this way, and I believe the tone set by the federal government trickles down to other areas of influence. So I believe it's your job to set the bar high and expect that everybody else at least meets that standard. Now, I need to clarify something about my comments. Once I saw I was on this panel with David, I decided to concentrate on getting some basic examples on the record, as David is far more knowledgeable than I am about the labyrinthine details of the Accessible Canada Act. So, my husband and I have just moved closer to downtown Kelowna so we can go out more independently. We thought we'd go to a relatively new place that offers dinner and a movie, but no. The movie party's upstairs and there's no elevator. It's been open less than 2 years. We have to check every place we go to see whether it's accessible for us. not something non-disabled people have to do. Recently, I went for a blood test in a relatively new office, again downtown and the main location. The cubicles that the blood tests happen in are too small for my wheelchair to fit, so I have to have my blood taken in a hallway in full view of everyone with no privacy. So being disabled often equates to having your dignity removed. The last time I flew was to Ottawa in April, ironically to appear before the Transportation Committee. Before boarding the plane, where it clearly says full assistance on my file, I was asked to leave my power wheelchair behind at the check-in desk and walk onto the plane. It's just one example of the many things that happen when we're flying while disabled. We are second-class citizens. The National Director at DWP, Rabia Khader, is blind. She cannot vote without another person reading out the candidates' names and her telling them her choice out loud. Rabia regularly receives letters in the mail from all levels of government with personal information. She has to get someone else to read to her, whereas if they came by email, she has the technology to read them privately. So she's denied these full rights of these basic rights of a full citizen. My friend Glenda, an award-winning master's student at Queen's University, is nonverbal. I asked her for a recent example of lack of accessibility she has faced. She told me that currently she has an issue with her business account at the CRA, and the only way they say they can fix it is if she calls them, but she can't speak. So this type of thing happens day in, day out. Through our work at DWP, we can tell you that barriers are hardwired into the federal government programs that disabled people living in poverty try to access. In 2022, the Auditor General said that the government doesn't have a clear picture of the hard-to-reach people not accessing benefits meant to support them. It's like the government can't connect the dots between the programs it has and the people who need them. We can see this happening in new programs, and it's simply inaccessible. The Canadian Dental Care Plan and the new Canada Disability Benefit, which David mentioned, first payment hopefully being July 2025, both require the disability tax credit as the entry point, a program that is woefully inadequate. There are 1.5 million severely and very severely disabled Canadians living in poverty who should be receiving the Canada Disability Benefit next year. However, the government's own figures say that only roughly 500,000 Canadians will receive it. So 1 million Canadians living in poverty will not receive a benefit they're entitled to. These people can't wait any longer, and certainly not until 2040. In 1966, Paul Hunt, a prominent English disabled man, said, "We are society as much as anyone and cannot be considered in isolation from it." The examples I've given today show that disabled people are still considered in isolation from the rest of society. Now, anyone who knows their sports history knows that 1966 was the only time that England won the World Cup. And while I might sound English, I was born in Canada during the 66-67 hockey season, which was the last time the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. Therefore, I ask you, what's most likely to happen first? England to win the World Cup, the Leafs to win the Stanley Cup, or for disabled people in Canada to be treated as full members of society? And which, if any, will happen by 2040? Thank you so much for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hewitt, and I do appreciate the way you put it in perspective. I'm not a Leaf fan. With that, we will begin with Ms. Gray, and again, if you would identify yourself and specifically to each witness that you want to question. You have 6 minutes, Ms. Gray.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Tracy Gray. I'm the vice chair of this committee on behalf of the Conservative team, and I'm wearing a black blazer with a cream-colored blouse, and I have blonde shoulder-length hair. My first questions are for Mr. Lipovsky. I'm not sure if you heard of the situation that occurred last week at this committee where the House of Commons administration created a barrier for a person living with a disability from testifying virtually who said he had testified previously. And within minutes of being notified of this, my Conservative colleagues and I took action. We tabled a motion which passed, which was to ensure the person was able to testify and for House administration to do an immediate investigation and report back to this committee within a month. My question for you is, do you think we can have a credible conversation about a Canada without barriers when even the highest government institution in the land parliament currently isn't without barriers?
Governments often talk about, of all political stripes, about the importance of their leading by example on accessibility. Now, we don't believe that anybody in the private sector needs to wait until the government gets it right. God knows, none of us are immortal. But it is especially important for government to get it right, especially at the core of democracy, especially when the government repeatedly talks about its commitment to the disability rights maxim, nothing about us without us. Well, you can't do that if we have barriers taking part. So I agree that these things need to be done, not only because they're embarrassing at a symbolic level, but because they're so easy to fix. The barrier you're talking about does not require us to tear down any buildings or adopt any new technology. It's technology we know how to use.
Great, thank you very much. You had told the Transport Committee in March of earlier this year that you, quote, dread entering Canadian airspace, unquote. Do you believe that other countries, such as the US or others, have better accessibility standards than Canada?
When I go to the States, which I do often, I feel like I'm going through a time machine into the future. I'm actually embarrassed as a proud Canadian to say this, but they're way ahead of us. And it's not because they invented people with disabilities before we did. It's simply because at a legislative level, they decided to pass something strong and effective way earlier, like 1990, not 2019 at the federal level, because they put in place much more effective enforcement than we have. Their federal government has much more effective enforcement because they've enacted much clearer, more comprehensive standards. Now, are they the paragon? There's lots they could be doing better, but they're way ahead of us. And with 1 billion people with disabilities around the world, it means they've got an edge on the tourism market of people with disabilities, and with the goal of ensuring that people with disabilities can fully participate. They're certainly ahead of us on multiple fronts. We should be catching up. We should have caught up by now and passed them.
Thank you. When I asked the Minister of Disability Inclusion in May, when she was at this committee, whether Canadians living with disabilities were facing a cost of living crisis, she wouldn't answer. And so my question for you is, do you believe Canadians living with disabilities are in a cost of living crisis and have been disproportionately affected by the cost of living crisis? And as well, do you think it's more difficult when Canadians living with disabilities may be more disproportionately affected with the cost of living crisis? And how does this play into creating a Canada without barriers, as this study is working on?
Absolutely, there is that cost of living crisis when the Parliament, this committee, and the Senate held hearings on the Canada Disability Benefit. You heard over and over how people with living with a disability costs more. If you look at what happened during the pandemic, the federal government created a benefit for vulnerable folks across the country, and then it did another benefit for people with disabilities, but one was a once-only payment, and it took months after it was created just to get it out the door. So yes, that is a huge problem. But just coming up with a Canada Disability Benefit that's only $200 a month maximum really is shows that the criticisms of that legislation from many of us were correct. We warned that this could happen. It did. And it also shows that those of us who criticized Bill C-81, the Accessible Canada Act, because it didn't impose more deadlines and detailed requirements on the federal government. Sadly, we're correct. We don't take any pleasure, pride, or joy in that. We wish we were wrong.
We've got about 20 seconds here left, so I'd like to ask, given that the Liberals promised with great fanfare that the Canada Disability Benefit was going to lift hundreds of thousands of Canadians with disabilities out of poverty, do you see this as a broken promise? And also, do you see it being fraught with redundant bureaucracy and red tape for persons with disabilities and those who support them?
All the criticisms of the benefit, I think, are valid, but what we also need, well, there's a federal election coming up. I hear by rumor, you folks may have heard it too, and it's going to be important for voters with disabilities to know what each of the parties will do on each of these, on the Accessible Canada Act and the Canada Disability Benefit. And we'd like it to be treated by all parties as a nonpartisan issue because these laws were both passed unanimous, and all parties agreed we needed them. So we'd like all parties to try to outbid each other for what you'll do to fix them.
Thank you, Ms. Gray, Mr. Lepofsky, Mr. Van Bynen for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I'd like to congratulate Kevin Mills on his incredible journey and the amount of work and effort that he's put into not just creating awareness in our community, but broadly. And my question is, what are the primary challenges with the disability community in promoting accessibility, and how can the government better and support your efforts?
Hi, again, thanks for having me. I think what you're doing here, having people with disabilities involved in committees like this, and just that perspective, by seeing, my perspective is going to be vastly different than people without disabilities. So I think I can help identify issues. And in terms of promotion, I think what I was doing there, like in terms of demonstration and going out in the public, and it's starting a discussion because even like if people weren't even following me online, they may have been driving by and see me in a wheelchair biking along the highway, and it would make them think. We also, when we went into campsites, we'd ask if they had an accessible shower, and they wouldn't, but then they said we should, and then they'd ask me what we can do, like what would the shower need to be to do it. So I think the biggest thing is having more people with disabilities travel to show the issues. Thank you.
I appreciate your efforts, and I'm sure that my colleagues are eager to learn more based on your lived experience. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Coteau.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all of our witnesses today. It was very interesting listening to your perspective. And I will join my colleague to congratulate Mr. Mills on your accomplishment. Thank you for being with us today. My questions to Mr. Lepofsky. You talked about some of the recommendations that you made. I think there were 10 recommendations. One of them was looking for ways to bring a more coherent enforcement approach. You talked about CRTC, CTA, and I believe the Commissioner. Can you talk a little bit more about how that would work in regards to your vision of enforcement?
Really appreciate the question. Essentially, right now the law splinters implementation and enforcement among the three. They each have to make their own enforcement regulations and forms and stuff. They each set up their own procedures. They each have separate procedures for how they process complaints in their other work, which are very different. So we have to navigate essentially three worlds. And not only that, the same obligated organization can have some of its obligations under the Accessible Canada Act enforced by the Accessibility Commissioners and others by the CRTC or the Canada Transportation Agency. It is impossible to figure this out. In fact, the minister then responsible for the bill, speaking to the Senate, gave an illustration of this, which I recall related to airplanes, and she actually got it wrong. And I don't say that to be critical of her. It's to be sympathetic of her because it's so bloody hard to figure out. So instead, how about one agency with a mandate to do all of this work. So it's one-stop shopping for obligated organizations and for individuals, one set of regulations instead of three. It's going to cost us less. And it also has an added advantage, which is that the CRTC and the Canada Transportation Agency have very, very sorry records of implementing accessibility. They've had a mandate not for 5 years, but for decades, and they've done it really poorly.
So can I ask another follow-up question?
Sure.
I know that there's a lot of responsibility that lies within the municipal, provincial level, which, I know you spend a lot of time working on. How do those relationships, the three levels of government, how does that work? And is there efficiencies there in regards to how the levels of government work together?
No, and I wouldn't expect there to be, and we should all live long enough for it to happen. So as a practical coalition trying to win results for people with disabilities who need action now, our best bet is to advocate to the provinces to handle the barriers they're facing and advocate to the federal government to address theirs. However, the federal government has an incredible constitutionally valid power to influence at the provincial/municipal level, which is when you're giving out federal money. When they gave federal money to Toronto to build a subway extension that opened before 2018 up to York University and beyond, they used that money to design subway stations that are replete with disability barriers. Now, and we put out a video, it's widely viewed online. People can Google David Lepofsky Public Transit Toronto, and they'll see these barriers that we filmed and documented. And the federal government should be attaching strings, simply saying, you want our money, no new barriers.
Okay, I think my time is up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coteau. Madame Chabot pour 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes, Ms. Chabot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. I want to thank all of our witnesses for these excellent presentations. My question will be for COFAN, Mr. Lupien, Mr. Salgan. Thank you for your advocacy on behalf of 1.4 million people, francophones. It's a huge amount of work, and you are an advocacy organization. We are studying the Accessible Canada Act here, which is a federal piece of legislation. For the members you represent, what are the main barriers to service by the federal government? I will ask Dominique to answer that question. Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ms. Chabot, for that relevant question. Every day, people with disabilities experience barriers and difficulties with universal accessibility, which is not respected in Canada and in Quebec, as well as with transportation, whether we're talking about air or other services. The Canada Border Agency services aren't always accessible for people with functional limitations. Work, businesses, the list is very long. So COFAN, our organization, has decided to focus on certain aspects. Of course, we know that some progress has been made, but a lot more has to be done. We can also look at what the other provinces are doing. In British Columbia, we have seen steps taken to make things more accessible than they are in Quebec. And I would also answer your question, Ms. Chabot, by saying that 27% of people have a disability, and that means 8 million people in Canada, 21% in Quebec. And according to the OECD, which is Quebec, has the highest rate of increase of people with disabilities. We are going to we have an aging population, and we're going to have double the number of seniors by 2031. We have to take steps to deal with the lack of oversight and thrust in this direction. For example, we have the Canada Building Code, which is federal, but it is not really followed in Quebec. We know that there is a professional order that in construction, and there is a small fine that can be imposed, but in Ontario, this is done better, and so we can follow the example of other jurisdictions when they are doing better. Thank you. I would follow up by saying that we had witnesses last week, but and you are quite right to say that our population is aging, and we are called on to support seniors, and including those with disabilities. Would you say that there is a change in culture underway when it comes to people with disabilities in society in general? That people are able to assert their rights better? Are we making progress? If I might, Ms. Chabot, it's a real problem in Quebec, I would say, and I have often testified and given interviews on the radio, and even I've said in Western Canada, I've congratulated people on their progress we have made being offered in Quebec. That's kind of where we're at for people with disabilities. We have signed the declaration with the UN. Quebec is responsible and has an obligation to implement the agreement with the federal government, and they aren't doing so, and sometimes we have to put pressure on them. We had to go to the UN with a complaint to deal with the penalty that was imposed. Well, that is a problem. The Accessible Canada Act isn't meeting its own objectives and addressing the problems at the federal level. So my question is, regardless of the differences between the provinces, is the Accessible Canada Act something that should have more teeth, should be able to obligate transportation companies and others to meet the standards? Should there be penalties and enforcement? So should the act have more teeth? Maybe sanctions as well as expected results. Thank you.
Thanks for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. It's good to have you all here before us. I'm Richard Cannings. I'm with the NDP, but I'm not the usual NDP person on this committee. I'm substituting today, but it's been very interesting hearing this testimony. I am going to start with Ms. Hewitt in Kelowna. I happen to live over the hill in Penticton, so I'm not over the hill myself, I hope, but it's good to have someone from the Okanagan here before us, at least even virtually. And Ms. Hewitt, you made some very compelling statements, I think, about, particularly about the Canada Disability Benefit, where you suggested that 1.5 million should be receiving this benefit, and we only have maybe a third of that qualify. And I've read elsewhere that only a few thousand people will actually be raised out of poverty because of this benefit. And part of that problem, as you said, is the requirement that around the disability tax credit, which is a very difficult credit to apply for. I know probably every MP here, at least certainly all my colleagues in the NDP caucus, have regular workshops to try to explain how to navigate that process of getting the disability tax credit. It's a very convoluted process. And I'm just wondering if you could explain how you see this disability benefit, how people would qualify for that. What would be the simplest and most straightforward way for the government to use to make sure that we're actually raising people out of poverty?
So thank you, and thank you for being here from the Okanagan as well. As David mentioned, I'm sorry, my service dog has decided our time is up, and you may hear a little bit from him in the background. As David mentioned, the cooperation between federal and provincial levels just doesn't exist, but we have excellent systems by and large, in comparison to the federal government, in the provincial systems for getting people to jump through the hoops to be awarded provincial disability assistance payments. We believe, as do many other disability organisations, as do some provincial governments, that once you've jumped through that hoop, that's enough. And you should be automatically eligible for the Canada Disability Benefit. Now, that may mean, because the government is adamant that the only list they have of disabled people is the disability tax credit, that may mean that the route is those people are made automatically eligible for the disability tax credit. It sounds so simple that it just floors me that it can't happen. But again, it comes to this lack of ability for different levels of government to talk to each other, for these responsibilities to stay siloed, and also the lack of imagination and the lack of drive to want to make this happen. Everybody working on this at the CRA, in the government, should be so embarrassed that they're, and working desperately hard to work out how those extra million people get this benefit. And that simply isn't happening. And I spend my days working on this, and as a volunteer for my organization, and we spend our time trying to come up with every method we can. Can we do roll-in workshops? Somebody suggested can we use the Army Medical Corps to roll through and get people signed up for the disability tax credit? But it's like filling Okanagan Lake with a teaspoon instead of a fire hose. And the fire hose is getting people automatically signed up once they've already jumped through significant hoops at the provincial, territorial and federal levels, including, as I understand it, people who already get CPPD, Canada Pension Plan Disability, are not automatically eligible for the Canada Disability Benefit. So you're receiving a federal disability benefit and you still do not become automatically eligible. So you can hear my passion for this. We are desperately letting down severely and very severely disabled people who live in poverty.
Okay, I have 1 minute left. Thank you very much, Ms. Hewitt. I'm going to turn to Mr. Lepofsky, and you said in your statements that you wouldn't have time to go over everything. I'm just going to give you this minute to add anything that you haven't had the opportunity to outline so far.
In the 2019 election, the federal government commendably promised that they would apply a disability lens to all federal policies. Require that in the Act. The government in the Senate got an amendment to the bill that actually hurts people with disabilities. It provides that even if you win a case against one of the huge airlines and you prove they got a barrier, if the barrier was actually one that one of the government's own regulations allowed, which no federal regulation ever should, the CTA can't order 1 penny in damages. They can say, fix the benefit that the regulation should never have permitted, but it can't compensate the victims. That should be out of this act.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cannings. Ms. Falk, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Rosemary Falk. I'm from Saskatchewan. I'm a member of Parliament, and I am a female with brown hair, and I'm wearing a floral dress today. I'd like to thank everybody for their testimony today and taking the time to come here. Mr. Lepofsky, I'm going to start with you quickly, if that's all right. Again, thank you for your return to this committee and your continued advocacy that you are continuing to do for people with persons with disabilities. When you appeared at this committee during its consideration for Bill C-81, you had raised concerns that the bill, quote, was strong on intention but weak on enforcement and implementation, end quote. So 5 years after the passage of this bill and from your opening remarks, would you say that those concerns still stand?
Absolutely. In other words, the core frailties with the bill are exactly the ones we sought to get identified 6 years ago and sought to get corrected, as did a number of other disability organizations.
Yes, I know we brought forward many amendments for that bill. This whole side of the table voted for a lot of those amendments to make sure that there was accountability and enforcement, because why are we going to go through all of this work and not have any enforcement or accountability? It just doesn't seem like a good use of resources. You've said a few times about this one-stop shop, basically, this agency that you suggest everything would be there. Would you say that if something like that was implemented, everything else would kind of fit together? Like, would that be the most important recommendation, or what would you recommend?
There are two things, really, that are at the top of the list. One is that, and the other is there have to be accessibility standard regulations enforced. Let me make this clear. If you want people to remove barriers, yeah, we could bring human rights complaints and then die of old age waiting to get them heard. Yeah, we could bring CTA or CRTC complaints about the same thing. But instead, the whole purpose for this act, and the minister at the time, Carlo Qualtrough, got it absolutely right. We shouldn't have to fight barriers one at a time. Let's pass accessibility standards regulations that identify the barriers to remove and the timelines. Without that, nothing else does much. And they haven't passed any of those in 5 years. Accessibility Standards Canada have come up with volunteer guidelines. That's all they could do. Commend them for their efforts. Commend them for doing what they could do. But I said before, it's thin gruel. Nobody would obey the speed limit if it was voluntary.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hewitt, I'd like to turn to you, if possible. I know you had mentioned a couple of examples of barriers, but I think a lot of times people think of a barrier as something that's only physical, but there's absolutely invisible barriers that we don't necessarily see. I would chalk this up to too much bureaucracy or red tape, which makes it difficult for people to be able to access the supports that they're needing. I know you had mentioned a couple of examples previously just with the CRA. Are there any other invisible barriers that are in place, knowingly or unknowingly, from the federal government that, if removed, would make it easier? Like, I think of plain language even, for example, like something so simple that we can just change the language to make it, easily read and understood. Is there anything that you would suggest that the federal government could change?
So I think, thank you very much for the question. And, I think, and certainly Ms. Gray knows, I have MS, and MS Canada has long fought for people with invisible disabilities and how that happens in our society. I the example I gave of my friend Glenda, who, as I say, is nonverbal, the attitudes that people who have communication disabilities face are, they're often, first of all, people start to shout at them because they decide they're deaf, or they treat them as if they have intellectual disabilities, but really she can't speak. And it's very simple that our system has so many things built into it. As I say, the CRA says they can only deal with her, and I had this issue myself, they could only deal with a phone call, and the wait time was so long. I have severe fatigue. It then went into the time in the day when I go to sleep. So I think that, it sounds like with the DTC and this example, it's sort of CRA is in my headlights, which they certainly are. But these attitudes are fundamental to how we approach all barrier removal. And I think that the invisible barriers in our society are the most insidious, because people say that they don't believe you because there isn't a test, there isn't a for a long time, also diabetic, for a long time I said, my MS, there's no test that can prove my invisible disabilities, which I believe are worse, if you like. I'm struggling for words now, which is one of my disabilities, than my mobility disabilities. But I'm also diabetic, and I can take a blood test every day and tell you exactly where my diabetes is. So I think what we have is an attitudinal problem, and that also comes with that lack of belief, and also that sense that disabled people, like that quote from 58 years ago from Paul Hunt, that disabled people are thought of in isolation, and that we're not thought of as just part of society. And, a blind friend has said to me that our streets are full of these accessible devices for everybody, street lights, and that she doesn't need them. So if we flip it the other way around, that
Ms. Hewitt, I do have to move on.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Falk.
Thank you.
For the conclude this round, Mr. Long for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to my colleagues, and thank you to our witnesses. Again, very compelling testimony. Mr. Lepofsky, my name is Wayne Long. I'm a member of Parliament, Liberal member of Parliament for St. John Rothesay. I do have a blue blazer, popping pink shirt, and messy brown and gray hair today. Mr. Lepofsky, you have my respect. I was a part of this committee in 2019 with MP Falk, MP Shabbat, that passed the Accessibility Act. We're very proud of that. And one thing I'll say about you, Mr. Lepofsky, is that you always told us like it was, the good and the bad. So you have my respect. Ms. Hewitt, I do think that the Leafs will win the Stanley Cup this year. And Mr. Mills, you came through New Brunswick. You were north of St. John, I believe, and I don't believe I've met you, but you have my respect for what you did. I hearken back to 10, 11 years ago, and one of our good friends, his name actually is Andy Bell. And just as a side note, his father's name was Tom Bell, and Tom Bell was a Conservative member of Parliament in St. John Rothesay for almost 25 years. So Andy is disabled. He's in a wheelchair. And again, this was 10 or 11 years ago. And I remember a group of us saying, listen, Aber, as we call them, let's go out for dinner. So we decided we were going to go out, and we picked him up. But it became very apparent how few restaurants we actually could get into. And, again, we never really thought about it, but I would say out of the 10 we had selected, only two of those restaurants that we could actually get a wheelchair into. And I also think back to my time. I've been a member of Parliament since 2015, but I think back to how many events I've actually attended in my riding that really weren't accessible to people with disabilities. So my question to you, Ms. Hewitt and Mr. Mills, we'll start with you, is like we have come forward, and like you said, people do mean well, but that doesn't get us to where we need to get. So what specific, we'll start with you, Ms. Hewitt, what specific recommendations would you suggest to the committee that we include in the report to ensure meaningful progress towards a barrier-free Canada? What more would you recommend that we put in this report? Thank you.
So, first of all, I think that you have to make the strongest statement possible that this situation is not acceptable, that 16 more years is not acceptable, and that you would like to hear that echoed by all party leaders. David speaks long and hard about all the pieces of legislation, all the teeth, all the lack of teeth, all the... At some point, somebody has to say enough, right? So I will pass my time on to somebody else, but I strongly believe that we need allies as disabled people. Our voices alone are not enough, even though we are 27% of the population. We need your voices to say enough, no more. No more messing around with, should we do this here and as David says, not another dollar spent.
Thank you. Mr. Mills?
Yes, thank you. I think I'm best speaking specifically about the bike route and disabled travel in general. When I talk about a bike route, I'm thinking of something that when it's made, it considers a wheelchair. So things like width, being signed, being easy to follow, and the surface. Like it has to be paved. It can't be gravel. We were cycling by a trail that goes across Canada, and honestly, it looked beautiful, but it was more for ATVs. It's not something I could access. It has to be a specific marked route, and along the way, I would also say being able to find hotels or campsites that are truly accessible, like making that standard for a shower, that it's not just grab bars in a bathtub. It's specific standards on travel. And then finally, flying home. That was so difficult. That was probably one of the hardest parts of the trip. And I think there has to be legislation to allow someone to sit in their wheelchair on a flight. That would have made the flight home much easier for me. I think a trail across Canada would be pretty amazing. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Lepofsky, a short closing comment.
Everything you need is in the 9-page brief that we've submitted. It's been emailed to every one of your offices. The government will post it on your website. It's at aodaalliance.org/Canada, probably the second link. And we suggest the findings you should make and the recommendations you should make. But ask those questions. Are we 25% of the way? No. Have we removed a significant number of barriers due to this act in 5 years? No. Therefore, the law needs to be strengthened, and we've given you 10 ways to do it.
Mr. Long and Mr. Lepofsky, thank you for appearing again. Mr. Mills, Monsieur Lupien, and Ms. Hewitt, Monsieur Salgado as well. With that, this concludes the first hour. We'll suspend for a few moments while we transition to the second panel. Suspend for 3 minutes. members, welcome back to the second and final panel for today. Again, I would remind all the witnesses to speak slowly for the benefit of the interpreters. So we have appearing in the room from the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, James Genereux, Policy and Government Relations. We have Bill Adair appearing. No. We have Christina Bezans, Chief Executive Officer, Community and Home Assistance to Seniors. And we had scheduled Mr. Bill Adair, but he is not reachable at the moment. So we will begin with Mr. Genereux for 5 minutes. Mr. Genereux, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you again today. Special thanks to MP Tracy Gray for helping make this possible to come back and speak to you. My name is James Gennaro, and I'm with the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. Our mandate includes caregivers, care providers, and care recipients of all sorts. As such, disability is central to our mission and informs all of our funding priorities, convening opportunities, as well as our policy and advocacy work. 1 in 4 Canadians is a caregiver today, and half of all Canadians will be a caregiver at some point in their lives. Half of all Canadian women already today are caregivers in 2024. Our recent survey report called Caring in Canada from May of this year showed that about 1/5 of all caregivers support someone with a physical or intellectual disability, including parents and loved ones supporting children and adults with lifelong disabilities. The passage of the Accessible Canada Act was a watershed moment for disability inclusion in Canada. In the months since, Canadians with disabilities have seen movement on implementation and standards development. Some excellent progress has been made. We now have a Chief Accessibility Officer and an Accessibility Commissioner. Millions of dollars have been allocated towards coverage of medical costs for the disability tax credit, and the employment strategy is well underway. Perhaps most importantly, the federal government has allocated millions of dollars to the Canada Disability Benefit, with the promise of more to come. This is farther than we were, but not as far as we could or should be. Millions of people with disabilities and the caregivers involved in their lives are crying out for help paying the bills, plain and simple. In 2021, Disability Without Poverty published a report card showing that 16.5% of people with disabilities lived in poverty, more than 1.5 million people. In contrast, 8.5% of people without disabilities across the country live in poverty. Inclusion Canada reports that the problem is particularly acute for people with intellectual disabilities, who face a poverty rate of some 75%. What does this have to do with caregivers? 1/5 of the caregivers in our survey reported supporting someone financially. Much of this can be traced to caregivers providing financial support to their loved ones with disabilities due to pervasive and deep poverty rates. Every dollar spent supporting someone they love means fewer dollars to pay the rent or purchase groceries for their families. 1 in 5 caregivers earn less than $20,000 a year. For caregivers who earn around or less than the median household income of $68,000 a year, nearly half report experiencing financial distress as a result of their care responsibilities. Much needs to be done to get more financial supports into the pockets of people with disabilities and caregivers. The Canada Disability Benefit is the future, and one which I hope will become a reality very soon. But in the meantime, the immediate next logical step within the context of this report is to focus on making existing programs and services properly accessible. Too many people with disabilities and caregivers are still unaware of the benefits to which they may be entitled and how to apply. Only 12% of caregivers said the person they support receives financial supports, and a mere 8% of caregivers receive the Canada Caregiver Credit. Those who have tried almost universally report finding the process arbitrary, opaque, and even Kafkaesque. I hope that the Accessibility Standards Canada Technical Committee, developing standards in this regard, will consider the views of people with disabilities and their caregivers and strive very hard to make the Canada Disability Benefit, the Canada Caregiver Credit, and of course, the Canada Disability Benefit as accessible as possible. In the meantime, let's take a massive hammer to the Disability Tax Credit and make it as simple as possible to access for everyone. People with disabilities and caregivers need help today. The framework and early steps under the Accessible Canada Act set the stage for making present and future support more accessible for all Canadians. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gennaro. Committee members, I have to suspend for a couple of moments. We're having technical issues with connecting with the people appearing virtually. So I'll suspend for 2 moments. Suspend. We'll resume. The technical issues have been resolved, and we will now turn to Ms. Bazans. Ms. Bazans, your camera is turned off. Ms. Bazans, can you hear? There you are. Ms. Bazans, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here to address all of you. My name is Christina Bazans. I'm the CEO of CHATS, Community and Home Assistance to Seniors. We're one of the largest multicultural nonprofit seniors organizations in Ontario, serving some 8,000 older adults and their caregivers in York Region and South Simcoe. Our mandate is to advocate for and deliver high-quality, person-centered home and community services to older adults and their family caregivers, providing dignity and choice for aging at home. And I'd like to thank MP Tony Van Bynen for inviting us to present to you today. CHATS is pleased that this committee is undertaking this study to consider progress towards the goal of building a barrier-free Canada by 2040. All around us, we do see evidence that many municipalities, communities, and organizations are addressing elements of this. As of the latest data, over 560 communities in Canada have committed to becoming age-friendly by making changes to policies, services, and structures to better support and enable older adults to age actively. Senior-friendly standards offer numerous benefits to older adults, enhancing their quality of life in several key ways, meeting basic needs, promoting mobility, encouraging social connections, and enhancing safety through design elements like non-slip flooring and better lighting to reduce the risk of falls and injuries. But while it's important that communities are looking to implement age-friendly standards, I'd also like to emphasize that this committee consider the importance of universal design standards to support older adults to live independently and safety in their own homes. Universal design standards for housing aim to create living spaces that are accessible and usable by everyone, regardless of age, disability, or other factors. As our population ages, and consider that by 2050, 10 years after the time frame of this study, the number of seniors over 65 will be double what it is today. It becomes increasingly crucial to adopt universal design principles that cater to their diverse needs in the near term. Currently, Canada faces a significant shortage of housing, especially housing that is more affordable. This is compounded by the real reality that builders are not constructing enough accessible housing. We understand that there are several factors that have impeded the housing industry's progress towards adopting universal design standards. They include higher costs and lack of incentive. Changing to building codes and regulations can be slow, thereby impacting accessibility requirements to new developments. Some builders may also underestimate the demand for accessible housing, assuming it's just a niche market. But at Chats, we see a growing need for accessible homes, especially in situations where family members are looking to support their older loved ones by living together. Unfortunately, the cost of modifying existing homes, despite various tax credits that have been made available, is often more expensive and complicated than building accessible homes from the start. With over 93% of older adults preferring to age in the right place for them, it's clear that there's a strong desire for homes that can adapt to changing needs. Universal design principles can help create homes that are safe and comfortable for aging in place. These principles are not just about making spaces accessible, but about creating environments that are usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. The fact that 38% of older adults aged 65 and older have a disability underscores the necessity for homes that accommodate various physical needs. As well, the high percentage of older adult renters at 32.8% indicates a significant demand for accessible rental housing. Norway is often considered a leader in universal design, particularly in the context of housing and public infrastructure. They've integrated universal design into national policies and legislation. Accessibility is a legal requirement. This approach is also supported by comprehensive planning, where municipalities are required to consider universal design in all planning and building activities, essentially making accessibility a fundamental aspect of your urban development. To be successful, integrating housing with essential services is a key aspect of creating supportive environments for older adults. This includes proximity to healthcare, transportation, and community services. These social connections are crucial for healthy aging, reducing the negative impact of loneliness and isolation on mental and health well-being that adds considerable costs to our health and social care system. Investing in universal design is not just a matter of convenience, it's a matter of necessity. As we look to the future, we must recognize that the demand for accessible housing and communities will only grow. At Chats, we're committed to advocating for these changes. We work tirelessly to support older adults through our programs and services, but we cannot do it alone. We need the support of policymakers, developers, and architects, and the community at large. Together, we can create environments where older adults can thrive, live independently, and enjoy the quality of life they deserve. In closing, I urge all of you to consider the options to promote and expand the importance of universal design in our communities. Let's build a future by 2040 where all citizens, regardless of their ability, can live with dignity, safety, and independence. Thank you for your attention and commitment to this vital cause, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Madame Bezant. We're now going to go to Mr. Adair, who I understand is now in the virtual room. And Mr. Adair.
He needs to open his camera.
Mr. Adair, you need to open your camera. There you are. Now we're going to begin with you, Mr. Adair, and the translators will tell me if the sound is okay. So you can begin when you're ready, Mr. Adair.
Thank you. I am Bill Adair, Executive Director at Spinal Cord Injury Canada, a board member of Accessibility Standards Canada, a member of Minister Kara's Disability Advisory Group, and a citizen who has a disability. Spinal Cord Injury Canada is also a member of the Canadian Transportation Agency's Accessibility Advisory Group. Believe me when I say I have been paying close attention to the progress of the Accessible Canada Act. In October 2018, I presented to this committee as part of the Federal Accessibility Legislation Alliance. At that time, we made 12 recommendations. I have included them in my written report, but I will comment on some of them now. The very first recommendation was to create a culture of inclusion and equity. We recommended that all people employed by the federal public sector engage in an intensive awareness and education program about disability, access, and inclusion. Legislation alone is not enough to develop inclusive attitudes and equitable practices. This recommendation was not included in the Act. In the last 5 years, we have witnessed how Canadian culture and our federal government has not shifted to be inclusive of people with disabilities in Canada. For example, low COVID payments, the introduction of MAID for people with disabilities during COVID, and a lackluster Canada Disability Benefit all demonstrate this fact. Oh, ableism is strong and present. Another recommendation back in 2018 was to ensure people with disabilities are compensated for their expertise. We said funding will make or break this legislation, so make it available to people with disabilities and organizations. Time after time, federally regulated entities approach people with disabilities and organizations asking for advice on their accessibility plans or progress reports, offering no compensation. They can tick the box for reaching out to us. Entities that must comply with the Act should have a yearly budget line to do the expected work. On another point, we recommended expanding compliance. We felt that entities that receive funding from the Government of Canada should also comply with the Act. New standards and regulations could clarify expectations. However, this point is moot, as sadly only one standard from Accessibility Standards Canada has been released in 5 years. There has been no follow-up with a regulation. There is so much work to do. Ironically, another one of our recommendations was not to delay and that all standards and regulations be implemented within 5 years. We also recommended that people with disabilities be included in the fabric of the Act. Inclusion honors the principle, nothing about us without us, and provides employment opportunities. Generally, I think Accessibility Standards Canada has incorporated this principle. However, I am concerned that we not lose momentum with the turnover of the CEO, the chair of the board, and several board directors all at the same time. These changes could reduce the board's effectiveness in providing governance and oversight. The board needs to be supported to fulfill its role while the staff focuses on operations. Otherwise, a large part of the disability leadership of the Act is lost. Speaking of disability leadership, it is also fair to say that progress stalled because of the delay in hiring the Accessibility Commissioner and the Chief Accessibility Officer. The government did not appoint them until the spring of 2022. Regarding employment opportunities, the federal public service was to hire 5,000 people with disabilities. I don't know how close we are to this number. I do know some people have been hired on contract, which is great. However, I know of several who do not have access to a pension because they are not full-time employees. Currently, the public service is on track with its accessibility plans and progress reports, but large private sector organizations are only at 52%, and small entities are only at 12%. The disability community fought hard to ensure the Act had a mechanism to enforce compliance through fines up to $250,000 per day. Why haven't the fines been used? What are we waiting for? Ultimately, a significant barrier to our progress is the lack of coordination and collaboration amongst the Act's primary roles. The Government of Canada should identify one role responsible for coordination, collaboration, and communication among the major players responsible for implementing different areas of the Act. The person in this role should be ready to take charge. They should keep track of and report on progress. They should ensure that when we reach 2040, we can look back and be proud of our success in our barrier-free Canada. If we keep going the way we have for the last 5 years, we will all look back with disappointment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Adair. Excuse me. We'll begin, and I want to advise the committee we'll have one 6-minute round, and then we'll suspend to conclude with committee business. So, Ms. Gray for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. My first questions are for Mr. Gennaro. Many caregivers are family members, are they not? Mm-hmm. Do you believe Canadians living with disabilities are in a cost of living crisis? And have families who are caring for family members living with disabilities been proportionately or disproportionately affected by a cost of living crisis in your perspective?
The simple answer is yes. The slightly more complicated answer is yes, definitely. The average caregiver in Canada, about one in five caregivers in Canada, I should say, are out of pocket to the tune of about $1,000 a month, just based on their care responsibilities alone. And about the same number, one in five Canadian caregivers earn less than $20,000 a year. So trying to find $1,000 a month extra costs when you're already living on a fairly limited income is a pretty tough job to do. And when costs keep going up at the grocery store, the hydro bill, the pump, you feel that pinch more and more every day.
Thank you. And what are some examples of some of the ongoing hidden costs that you hear about, whether it's home renovations, medical supplies, medical equipment, or others? And have those items gone up proportionately higher than the inflation rate?
It's a very good question. The problem is not so much that they're hidden. They're in plain sight. You know you're going to need to do a home modification. You know you're going to need to purchase a certain number of packages of Ensure, for example, a dietary supplement or incontinence aids and stuff like that. They're not hidden costs because you know they're coming, but the part that's hidden is how high those prices will go every time you go to the grocery store. We now see across Canada, and we saw less so now, but we were seeing across Canada shortages of Ensure, this critical dietary supplement. In some places there were shortages, in other places the prices were skyrocketing pretty quickly, over and above the increases in the cost of living that we were living with, particularly in those periods of higher inflation. We've started to see some of those prices stabilize, and the supply chains have stabilized as well, but the base price for a lot of those aids that people with disabilities desperately need remains high.
Based on your experience, would caregivers often be the ones who take care of things like scheduling or managing appointments and healthcare needs, as well as helping fill out any government paperwork for benefits, as an example?
Absolutely, yes. But I can say that both professionally and personally as a caregiver myself.
Have you heard if the Liberal government policies of the Canada Disability Benefit are fraught with redundant bureaucracy and red tape for persons with disabilities and those who support them?
So I think there's a big opportunity for improvement here. The suggestion is that the disability tax credit will be one of the ways through into the Canada Disability Benefit. Our position is that that is fine as one avenue into the disability benefit. We stand with our allies who say that the eligibility for provincial disability supports should also be considered automatically acceptance into the Canada Disability Benefit. But for the disability tax credit, this is why I threw in that line about taking a massive hammer to the disability tax credit, because it is itself Kafkaesque, bureaucratic, very difficult to access. It can be good and it can make a difference in the lives of a lot of people, but if those barriers are sky high to get in the door in the first place, it shouldn't really be considered as the open door to the next bit of support from the government.
On a different topic, have you heard of specific barriers for persons with mobility assistance needs being created by different or conflicting rules from different levels of government, such as in building construction or road infrastructure, or with various types of transportation?
Not specifically, but if you'll indulge me with an example around the disability tax credit, I was born missing an arm. I've worn a prosthetic my whole life. I've claimed the disability tax credit myself and have for a long time. I know people in a similar situation, missing another limb, a leg, or another arm. I have never had to reapply for the disability tax credit, but people I know who, same condition, born from birth, missing a limb, every few years have to prove once again that they're still missing their limb. That, to me, is an example of an improvement that could be made probably tomorrow with some really good dedicated work on the part of the Canada Revenue Agency to make all of this easier to access for people with disabilities.
Sorry, did you say that they have to keep proving
periodically
that they still don't have a limb?
And that's not exclusive.
As an example?
That's not exclusive to missing a limb. It's true of mental health and it's true of other disabilities as well. But I use that as an example just because I know it a little bit better.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
We had heard comments from another previous witness Paul Clark that was here, that was telling us about mobility devices, how they can go further and faster. But accessible infrastructure is often designed for mobility devices of 50 years ago. And so have you heard of any comments from caregivers who you work with who may have challenges with infrastructure not keeping up with the technology of today?
Certainly, particularly in the context of a powered wheelchair. So you're right to say that many of the standards, both provincially and from the Canadian Standards Association, are based on the sort of post-Vietnam War manual operation wheelchair that is ubiquitous all over the world. But more and more people are using power wheelchairs, which is a life-saving and mobility-saving aid that makes it possible, as you say, to go longer, to go faster, and to live your life in a more liberated, independent way. Things like wider doors and the like are not built for that.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. Mr. Van Bynen for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions will be directed towards Christina Bazans. Christina, you covered a lot of ground in your comments, and I'd like to unpack a little bit of that. So based on your many years of experience in supporting seniors through the CHATS organization across York Region and Simcoe County, as well as your role as a municipal councillor, can you share some of the barriers that the federal government can help to better address?
Thank you, MP Van Bynen, for that question. It's a great question, and one that I think this study has an opportunity to really look into some of the issues where there's opportunities that may be made available to individuals to better be able to access services and so forth. But if you don't have the basic ability to enter a house or a home, wherever that may be, because of a wheelchair or what have you, I think that it's adding yet another layer of challenge and inaccessibility to those who could either otherwise live quite independently in their own homes.
Would you suggest that the federal government should include some of those standards in the building code that apply nationally?
I think we've got we've got the universal design standards available to us, and Canada has actually been lauded for those universal design standards. The challenge is getting them implemented, and as I indicated, there are a number of reasons why developers or the building industry have not necessarily responded, but also why the building codes have taken a long time to make changes and to recognize that those design standards should just be a part of the building code.
Given the federal, provincial, and municipal governments have different jurisdictions and responsibilities, how would you envisage them working together for the benefit of persons with disabilities?
Well, I think that there would be an opportunity, for example, to offer training programs, for example, to architects and builders and developers on universal design principles through partnerships with educational institutions and professional organizations at all levels. Also, perhaps looking at ways to provide financial incentives, such as through tax credits or grants to developers who incorporate those universal design principles in their projects. And then finally, to also engage with groups like CHATS and disability advocacy groups and other stakeholders to gather input, ensure that the standards meet the needs of all users. We've heard, from the other presenters today, and I think, we're all sharing common thoughts and common recommendations on what needs to change and what can be changed in order to alleviate some of these barriers and challenges for accessibility.
We've had a lot of discussion about the hard infrastructure that needs some attention. I'd like to spend a few minutes on social infrastructure, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to explain what NORCs are and how they may be part of the solution towards providing service and accessibility for people with disabilities.
So NORCs are naturally occurring retirement communities that typically have more than 30% of the residents within the NORC area. And that could be a building or a cluster of buildings or, a building within a neighborhood where there are a significant number of older adults living that brings together services and supports within the NORC to enable seniors to have access to information, social programs. In some instances, NORCs will offer primary care support. They may have a nurse practitioner who comes in once a week to speak with the residents or tenants in some cases. But essentially what it does is brings services and social engagement and activity to where the seniors live, as opposed to expecting that seniors are going to go out somewhere else, have to travel to receive those services and social opportunities.
Thank you. One last question. We have about a minute. What specific recommendations would you suggest the committee include in its report to ensure more meaningful progress towards a barrier-free Canada?
Well, I think that, following on your question regarding the NORCs and universal design standards, to really be successful, we have to look at an integrated way of integrating housing with essential services in order to create those supportive environments for older adults. And that includes proximity to healthcare, transportation, and community services.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
Ms. Chabot, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses, Mr. Adair. I see that you represent people with spinal cord injuries and other related disabilities. Would you say that the current legislation is adequate to meet its purpose in eliminating barriers? And if not, what do we need to change?
Thank you for the question. The Act has some very strong components that are not being implemented with the kind of speed that's required that would make changes, drive changes more quickly. So, for example, the regulations that are required, that are mandatory, that federally regulated entities would be required to comply with. We have one standard, but it hasn't been turned into a regulation. How quickly will it be turned into a regulation? So accelerating the speed of that. I think there is low-hanging fruit available in terms of we have over 400 large federally regulated entities who are ignoring the requirement of creating an accessibility plan and posting annual updates. No fines have been issued. I don't know anything about what kind of pressure is being put on these organizations, but it's to me a matter of exercising the enforcement that is in the Act that could actually have an impact on the change, on a change of removing barriers and preventing new barriers. So I think the Act has a lot of tools that are effective. I think so there's a lot there, but I think there's much more that could be brought in. I pointed out that paying attention to and pouring resources into shifting the culture, the attitudes of people in Canada towards those of us with disabilities, over 6 million people. It's the attitudes that need to shift, and then the changes will come much more quickly because people will embrace the changes as opposed to, oh, it's just a box to tick.
I imagine that there are many barriers, but if there are there aspects in particular that would help with inclusion in employment or access to transportation? Are there barriers otherwise? Another witness talked about housing that needs particular attention.
Yes, I know that the barriers that exist in Canada for people with disabilities have been well documented. We know what they are, yes, more speedier action on implementing changes would produce results in terms of removing barriers. So you just mentioned housing. There is a principle or a concept called accessible ready housing that is being implemented in BC. So when new housing starts are being funded, the government of BC requires them to comply with the requirements to build an accessible ready housing. So it's not fully accessible, but it can be made accessible for minimal costs. So this allows people to age in place. This allows people with disabilities to purchase a house that's new, or a home that's new, an apartment that somebody has moved out of. So it reduces the costs and it opens opportunities for people with disabilities. Accessible, affordable housing for people with disabilities is a major crisis, and this would take us a good step forward to addressing that issue. So I know that Accessibility Standards Canada has released guidelines on accessible ready housing, and they are fast-tracking a standard on accessible ready housing. But will that standard be turned into a regulation, which is enforceable, whereas a standard is voluntary? And will the Minister of Housing, with the Government of Canada, create a position that we will provide financial assistance to provinces and territories for housing, but you must comply with the standard and the regulation that's been created by Accessibility Standards Canada? We're asking the minister to make that commitment. We have no reply yet, but that's a very clear example of a step that could be taken right now to increase accessible and affordable housing for people with disabilities in the future.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you. If you have any other suggestions to strengthen the legislation, we would be very happy to receive them. Thank you.
Excuse me, Madame Chabot. Madame Zerillo for 6 minutes and to conclude today's witness testimony.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start by asking Witness Adair, but if I have time, I have some questions for Witness Gennaro too, or just around recommendations in the report for other tax entitlements or lack thereof that might need review or updating, because we know that it is witness testimony that drives recommendations in these reports, so certainly would love to have that. Witness Adair, you mentioned about the creation of a culture of inclusive attitudes. So there's two things I wanted to ask. One is, could you table for us or for this committee, supply this committee to be tabled, the 400 organizations that are in contravention of the Act at this point in time? And second of all, I raised this point last meeting. It is true. The 7 priority areas of the Accessible Canada Act do not include create a change in culture. And I wonder if you could give us a recommendation of what could be placed into the Accessible Canada Act to address this need for culture change.
Thank you for the questions. I would refer you to, in terms of answering the question of the large private sector companies, 410 who are not in compliance with the Act. This is under the jurisdiction of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So I have asked them for that information. It's not available. I would love to reach out to those 410 organizations and offer to help, to educate them about their responsibilities and for compliance, and to help assist them with creating the plans. And likewise, the small private sector companies, which includes organizations with 10 to 99 employees, 644 are not in compliance, so a much larger number. So that's the answer to your question is no, I can't tell you exactly who those organizations are, but I would like to know because we would like to be part of the solution and help them come into compliance. In terms of the culture shift, that is something that could be built into the act at this point, or there could be funding put in place in the government of Canada, which encourages and supports the interventions which are going to actually change attitudes of people in Canada towards those of us with disabilities. We know that the government of Canada has introduced and required a GBA plus training as training to ensure that the unconscious biases people are aware of them, and hopefully those biases are removed. And as a result of that, people in this community are accepted and included.
Sorry, Witness Adair, I don't have much time. So would you recommend that all public servants take some mandatory training around disability?
Yes, I do.
Thank
yes,
you
I would,
so
and I would require that those involved in doing the training and the educating be people with disabilities.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move to Witness Gennaro. Could you share with us your thoughts on the tax entitlements and which might need review and additions?
If I may, I'll give you 4 categories. The Canada Caregiver Credit, the Disability Tax Credit, the 2 EI caregiving benefits that exist today, and the broad umbrella of medical expenses that are allowed to be deducted from your income taxes at the end of the year. I would suggest that all 4 of those categories need to be dramatically reviewed and dramatically altered within the scope and the context of this legislation to make them as accessible as possible, as easy to access, err on the side of putting some more support into the hands of people with disabilities and a timely response as well.
Wonderful. And it seems I still have 2 minutes, so I wanted to talk a little bit about your organization recently released a report, a wide report. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that report, and also too, I would like to have the report tabled for this for this study. Go ahead.
It would be my pleasure to provide that to the chair. I'll defer to the clerk on how best to do that. We have it available in English and French at your convenience, of course. One of the key findings of this data report that I also mentioned in my comments is that 1 in 5 Canadians right now, or 1 in 5 caregivers right now, providing care to somebody else is a senior. So once you get to the age of 65, you are more likely to be one diagnosis or one accident away from needing care yourself. If you're already in a situation where your life is providing care to somebody, all of a sudden you receive that diagnosis or you slip on a patch of ice, what had been a difficult situation of care quickly turns into a crisis of care. And the absolute reality for many of these folks is that there isn't a lot of help out there for you if you find yourself in that situation. That's one finding.
And very quickly on that, so the 65 to 74, we know that OAS was not increased for those aged 65 to 74. We debated that in the House today. It is impacting caregivers of that age. Can you let me know what an additional $73 a month could do to help a caregiver?
So much. I believe the last time I was before this committee, I spoke in favor of that particular bill that coming from our friends in the bloc. We support that wholeheartedly. The more support we can get into the hands of seniors and caregivers, the better. We see the economic impact of a cost of living crisis and pensions being squeezed every week and every month. The more we can do to help this population, the better. So we're certainly behind it. Thank you.
Thank you. 8 seconds left. So if you're going to cede that generously, Madame Zarillo, we will then conclude because we do have 15 minutes of committee business. And I want to thank all the witnesses that appeared today and giving the testimony that you have. So thank you all for taking your time to appear before this committee on this important study. So I'll suspend for 2 minutes while we transition to in-camera, and I would ask those not on the committee would have to leave the room. Suspend for 2 minutes.
Can I just, before you do, can we just assure we are going to get that that report to this committee for the analysts?
Well, yes, you requested
Thank
it,
you.
and Mr. Generou indicated
Perfect.
he would send it. So, yeah, it's. you can provide whatever written material to the committee you choose in support of your testimony. Yes. Suspend for 2 minutes.